Hi BookTube, and welcome to my weekly wrap-up. I'm talking about two novels today. One is my honouring of Philip Roth's recent passing with his The Great American Novel. And the other is a new writer to me, Rana Dasgupta, Solo. And the good news is these were both terrific reads, and in Dasgupta I think I found a new author who I'm going to go back and read everything by him. So I'm going to start with Solo. So this is the story of a 100-old-year Bulgarian man who is blind and is sort of supported by his neighbours who sort of do his cooking and cleaning and stuff. And he's just looking back on his life in the first part of the novel, which ordinarily is not my type of novel at all, because I don't like sort of flashback books. I don't like books that are just stories of a life. But there's something about this. Obviously, Bulgaria as a country at the start of his life and the start of his sort of memories was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was collapsing. So then it came more into the sphere of sort of Europe. And then there was a struggle in Bulgaria pre-Second World War between the fascists and the communists, and the fascists won. And then there was sort of repression of the country. And then it was taken over by the Germans and involved in the Second World War. And then, of course, as sort of Nazi Germany collapsed, it came under the sway of the Soviet Union, and then there was sort of repression of all the former fascists. So a fairly unhappy history, not untypical for that region. It's worth saying that of all the Soviet satellite states, Bulgaria is probably the most sort of pro-communist and almost had a communist majority of its own, without the Soviet Union liberating it. So the character himself, he only ever leaves Bulgaria once, and that's to go and study chemistry in Berlin. And as a child, he was learning the violin, and sort of against his sort of father's wishes, really, because his father thought this was, sort of trivial pursuit. His father was a man who'd sort of, as Bulgaria emerged from the Ottoman Empire and sort of wanted to sort of make its sort of mark on the map of Europe, sort of took after Germany as a sort of inspiration in terms of sort of modernisation, industrialisation, chemistry, in which Germany was the leader in. But his father built railways, was a railway engineer, and was involved in building the line from Bulgaria all the way to Baghdad, in Iraq. And his mother was very much an Orientalist, and she took the young boy over to Baghdad and other places in the Orient for. It was never quite specified. The child had suspicions that she was carrying out an affair there, but she was very much an Orientalist and introduced him to sort of, the sort of, the splendour of sort of civilizations such as in Baghdad. But when he came back and he started to learn the violin, and his father, I can't remember exactly why now, but his father threw the violin into the fire, and that sort of ended his sort of his musical career. But what he most remembered is the chemical smell of the resin in the fire, and from there he proceeded to sort of develop an interest in chemistry, aided by his best friend Boris, whose father was a chemist and had a sort of a secret lab up in the top of their house. So that's his childhood, and then he goes to Berlin to study chemistry. But he's called back partway through because his family hit a crisis as Germany's economy collapses. His father had a lot of sort of investments there, and they were sort of wiped out. So the family are thrown on into penury. And Ulrich, who's the protagonist, I should say that's what his name was. He goes back to help his family out, and so he abandons his career in chemistry, and he leaves behind the love of his life, Clara, who's a German, and he's then, as I say, he never leaves the country after that, and he's sort of a passive witness to all the events of the sort of, the struggle between the communists and the fascists, in which his friend Boris, who was an ardent communist, is eventually executed. Then the sort of takeover of the Soviets after the Second World War, and in which he is recruited to start up a barium chloride plant because of his training or half training in chemistry. And he's very much, he plays ball. He's not a communist enthusiast. They keep asking him to join the party. He doesn't join the party. He's very passive. But all of this has an amazing ring of authenticity about the history of Bulgaria. And Rana Dasgupta is a British writer. Obviously within an Indian background, and I think has returned to live in India. And I find it remarkable that this reads so authentically about Bulgaria. Now I don't know, reading his biography, I didn't see that he'd spent time in Bulgaria as a student or anything. I mean, he's just, I don't know, his powers of research, and yet this is a very well told tale. It builds the world of pre-war Bulgaria, of Soviet time Bulgaria, and the post-Soviet when the Russian empire has collapsed. But it does it. It doesn't take pages and pages and pages to do it. It's done very economically through the storytelling. A line here about the factory, his barium chloride factory, that before he sort of develops it, it's a sort of an abandoned factory, and just it's supremely well done. This is a real sort of craftsman at work here. So that's the first half of the book. And then the second half is because he's blind, although he can listen to TV, he spent by his own admission he spends most of his day daydreaming. The second half of the story is a daydream of his. About what if Boris hadn't been executed by the by the fascists? What if he'd stayed with his musical career that he'd abandoned to join the communist cause? So in the second half of the book, Boris is this sort of fantastic sort of folk Bulgarian musician who goes to New York, or is discovered and goes to New York, where a sort of Svengali figure called Plastic, that's his first name, manages him, and he becomes a sort of a world phenomenon. And also there's a section on there about sort of post-Soviet Georgia, the country Georgia, because Ulrich's mum came from Georgia. And again, we're taken into the realm of a post-Soviet collapse Georgia and the rise of gangsterism and everything that reads very, very authentically. But also what you realise is, in the first half, Ulrich has shown himself to be a fairly unimaginative, sort of straight down the line guy who sort of passively, observes all that's gone on as Bulgaria changes its various fates. But in the second half, it's all about this sort of wonderful creativity and imagination that spins this fantastical story around Boris, around a woman and a poet, brother and sister. The woman was married to a Georgian gangster. So the first part of that story takes place in Georgia, but when he's assassinated, she has to flee for her life, and she ends up in New York, and she drags her poet brother with her for a bit of familiarity, and the poet brother becomes Boris's best friend. So it's a sort of a triangle, although it's not really a sexual triangle. It's not a sort of ménage à trois. Although the sister has hooks up with Plastic, and she has a relationship with him, and again it's just great storytelling, very credible storytelling. I give this 4.5, and the only reason I didn't give it 5 probably is because in the second half the character of the brother, the poet, you want to slap him really. He's so fey and so sort of wrought and sort of wrapped up with his own angst and never creates anything, and I just thought he was a bit sort of feeble, and a bit of a sort of a cliched caricature of a poet. But other than that, I just thought this was surprisingly given what it is, which is just storytelling as storytelling, and in doing so giving you an insight into a couple of countries in the world like Georgia and Bulgaria that you might not know much about. But this won me over. As I say, so much so I've invested in his first novel, which is called Tokyo Cancelled, which I think is about a flight is cancelled and the 12 passengers are sort of left in the airport lounge waiting for the next one, and they drawn from all over the world, and they tell each other their stories. So again, it seems to be about storytelling. But he's such a supreme stylist that I'm really looking forward to that. So Solo, 4.5 stars. And on to Philip Roth, the great American novel. I've read 5 or 6 Roth books. None of the ones I've read have been what you'd call his comedies. Portnoy's Complaint, Goodbye Columbus, all that sort of Jewish shtick, sort of Woody Allen in literature, I'd avoided because it doesn't interest me. It's, and also the obsession that Woody Allen has, that Howard Jacobson in the UK has, and that Roth in his Jewish novels has about male sexuality, male sexual prowess. I'm completely uninterested in it. So when I picked up The Great American Novel, I assumed it was going to be satirical on the Great American Novel, but what I didn't realise was how funny this is. This is sort of laugh out loud. Now, before I get into it, the one thing I will say is I'm a baseball fan, so, I'm not stymied by any of the sort of slightly jargony or the flipping of sort of baseball's hallowed rules or traditions on its head. I recognise them and I see the humour in them. If you're not a baseball fan, if you're not familiar with it, I don't know quite how much of that you're going to be able to appreciate because I can't put myself in that position. So for me, this is 5 stars, if not 5.5 stars, although that's not a thing really. But the only slight reservation I'd have about recommending it to everyone is, perhaps a sort of ground knowledge of baseball might enhance your read than not having it. I don't know, so I can't put myself out of that. But anyway, on to the book itself. So it starts off with a prologue in which a sports journalist called W. Smith, W standing for Word, i.e. Wordsmith, who's affectionately known as Smitty. He is smitten by alliteration. And the novel starts off with this sort of, chutzpah amount of, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of alliteration, and real ebullience. The novel launches itself at you, sort of right in your face. And Smitty is sort of waging a campaign for not only a forgotten baseball player, but a whole forgotten league, because the book posits that there are 2 leagues in America in baseball. One's the American League, one's the National League. This book posits that there was a third called the Patriot League. And the reason you've never heard of it is because, due to dark goings on, which the rest of the novel reveals, all knowledge and acknowledgement of this league has been suppressed. It's been censored because it shows America up in a bad light. And Smitty is campaigning to get one of its former stars elected into the Baseball Hall of Fame, and even manages to get to see the baseball commissioner. Says, this is my vote, I cast my vote, and thinks he's done a good thing. And then the results come out, and still no mention of this guy. So that's how the book starts. And it also turns out that Smitty is a sort of a poker player in in White House circles, is a ghost speechwriter, alliteration and all, though he tones it down for the president's speeches. So he's a man of who's, if not direct influence, at least has been, around power. But then the rest of the book until the epilogue is about the dishonourable, disgraceful and hilarious story of the Patriot League. So it's wartime America, 1943, and one of the 9 teams of the Patriot League, called the Rupert Mondays in New Jersey, where they are is a port. They're not the only port team in this league, but they're the one that has been chosen to give their give their stadium up to be a collection centre for things and troops and everything that are going to be shipped out. So they go on the road. So the baseball season is 162 games a year through the summer. So normally you play about 80, 81 at home and 80, 81 away. But the Rupert Mondays have to play 162, so they're always on the road. The other thing about them is that the owner, who in their pomp when they won the league, has died and given and in his will his 2 sons to get the team. And straight away they sell off all the assets, including the guy that W. Smith put up for the Hall of Fame. And they just get all these these useless, past it old players. There's a guy with one leg. There's a guy with one arm. People who you would never imagine as baseball players, and they're getting their hide kicked out of them in games because they're hopeless. But what is so beautifully done by Roth? First of all, is the choreography. How he manipulates the 9 players of the team, the manager, other teams that they play, things going on the field, things going on off the field, it's a supreme canvas control that Roth has, and it's beautifully choreographed. It's funny, but also you have to admire the level of control. And these are real characters. Yes, they're exaggerated for comic effect. So, for example, he talks about a picture, not for the Rupert Mundos, for another team. Comes up, he's a 19-year-old, he's an absolute phenomenon, no one can lay a bat on him. But he has a bad attitude. He is so full of himself. And basically he gets into this spat with an umpire who sort of denies him what's called the perfect game. And they sort of have a rivalry uh, and a sort of grudge against each other, which sort of harks back to the other part of the prologue. Is Smitty is discussing with Hemingway and others, but particularly Hemingway, what makes the great American novel. And Hemingway keeps sort of saying, oh, it's going to have to be written by some Italian waiter, and then some next day it's some, bloke in a fish market. Because what Hemingway is implying is America is so diverse, such a melting pot, that who could possibly represent the whole of America in one book called The Great American Novel? And he sort of turns around to Smitty and sort of says, yeah, you'll write it. And the one book that they sort of cite is Moby Dick. There's a bit of discussion about Moby Dick, and the feud between the picture and the umpire is sort of, I haven't read Moby Dick, but I gather that it's sort of echoing that sort of the great white whale, this sort of chimerical thing that the grudge between these two is like Captain Ahab's sort of obsession with the white whale. That the umpire is obsessed with this picture. This picture is obsessed with the umpire. So that is the first chapter, but the first main chapter is that feud. But then we get into the Rupert Mundos themselves, and as I say, the characters, they are all introduced to us, and what their sort of foibles and sort of physical drawbacks as baseball players are. But then beyond that, they become human characters. So there's a scene, for example, post game where there's a 14-year-old second baseman and a sort of grizzled first baseman, and the first baseman takes the 14-year-old to, but what he thinks is going to be a whorehouse, but it isn't. It's one of those sort of sex parlours where men go to be treated as babies, because the first baseman thinks that the 14-year-old's missing his mum. So there's a lot of stuff like that, but again, coming back to this idea of the choreography of how Roth is building up and moving these pieces on the board to tell the bigger story of not only the league but the politics of America at the time, because this deals with racism, it deals with imperialism, it deals with Reds Under the Beds and Joe McCarthy scare. All of these things are beautifully filtered through baseball. He doesn't sort of stop the baseball action to go and spout off theories about, McCarthyism and all that. It is all done through these characters, moved around on Philip Roth's chessboard canvas of this book. It is so clever, so well done. So, there's Jewish owners. There's another owner of a rival team who's basically a carny sort of sideshow circus Barnum type who just manipulates the crowd. And one of the stunts he pulls is he brings in a dwarf player who's so small that there's no strike zone, because the strike zone in baseball is between the shoulder and the knee. Because this guy's so small, he will always get what's called a base on balls, a walk, because no pitcher can pitch it between his knees and his shoulders. And then the manager brings in another dwarf who's a pitcher, who again sort of has some sort of success because of his reduced height. But then these two dwarfs hate each other because one regards the other. One has a very bad attitude anyway, but he's smaller than the other one and thinks therefore he should get all the profile because he is the smallest. And they have a terrible showdown, which is very funny. It's very offensive as well, but it's very funny. But again, it's this sideshow sort of manipulator character, and it's sort of predates all our knowledges of how it is bread and circuses, but it's done in the modern media age and how you whip up, sort of campaigns where people get on the back of and they, one's the bad guy, one's the good guy. I mean, it's sort of WWE wrestling. It's a precursor of all of that. It's just so brilliantly done. Then there's another section on the manager of the Rupert Mondays is a devout Christian, and he goes to Africa to he's already been to Japan and introduced baseball to them, but then he goes to Africa to introduce baseball to a primitive tribe. And again, it sort of veers and teeters between being sort of really offensive, but actually a lacerating sort of takedown of American imperialism and its attitude towards non-white Americans. It's a supreme bit of writing. And then we get into the Cold War. The sort of the second half of the book is very much about the conspiracy theory that the reason the Mondays have been told to go on the road is not because it's to help the war effort, but it's to help. They're such a ragtaggled team. They're in last place in the league. Is that they will undermine the Patriot League, and if you undermine baseball in America, it strikes at its fundamental values. That it even threatens to bring down America. And that all this is a commie plot, that sending the Mondays on the road and having all these cast of characters do these crazy things and sort of bring baseball into disrespect will bring down baseball and will bring down America and make it right for sort of communist takeover. And then, it's absurd, but you can see what Roth is doing. It's satire. He is satirising it, but for satire to work, it has to sort of be a grain of truth, and that is how Americans were thinking at the time of the McCarthyite trials, that everyone was a red. These great sports heroes, or in this case, these great sports losers, and suddenly one or two of the characters become representative of either America or the Soviet Union. Characters that you think have been dealt with in history come back, and you see that they're guys. Under two flags. Are they red or are they American? And in the, I'm not going to give a spoiler, but in the epilogue, the last line of the epilogue is comes back to this notion of the great American novel. And the last line is just a brilliant take on it, which again, I can't spoil for you. But, this truly, A, it's very funny. B, it's a savage sort of attack on sort of the American sort of apple pie values and beliefs and traditions. It's a historical document about the state of America in the 50s. Roth wrote this in 1973. There's even a sort of a parody of the Kennedy assassination, but on the baseball field. But it is the great American novel, because what Roth does amazingly is that he encapsulates all of America, all of wartime America and post-war America, through this filter of baseball in this novel. And he does so knowingly, because the last line very much sort of spotlights that, what Roth's attitude towards it. Now, can a work of satire genuinely be a great American novel in the sort of sense of an epic novel? Well, probably not. But, I think that's part of Roth's message. He is sending up the great American novel. I think he's saying, this is a ridiculous pursuit of, there's no such thing as the great American novel, as Hemingway alluded to, or at least the Hemingway in this version of him, written by Roth, alluded to. And I can't extol this book enough. At the start of the year, I read Jarrett Kobek's I Hate the Internet, which lacerated sort of Americana, particularly Silicon Valley, and how that's changing America, but how it changes all our sort of lives through how we interact online. And I thought that was a sort of superb read. And this too. So already I've got two books duking it out for my book of the year, because I can't see either of them being beaten. And interestingly, both are funny. Novels do not have to be funny for me to enjoy them. I also like very serious-minded novels. But it so happens that my two favourite books of this year so far, 6 months into the year, are both exceedingly comedic and satirical. I think this is more directly satirical than Kobek's, but Kobek's is very satirical as well. So, I'm in love with this book. I'm so pleased this is the one I chose to honour Philip Roth with, because he's honoured me with just a supreme act of writing. In the same way this guy demonstrates control and craft. Roth, through how he moves a whole myriad of characters, from players, from owners, from the commissioners, how he moves them out the chessboard without making a single false move is staggering. and I'm in awe of this book. It is truly, truly, truly stupendous. And I'd always been in two minds about Philip Roth because, as I say, there are lots of his books that I really sort of have no intention of reading. But this book, American Pastoral is in my all-time top 10 novels. So, to me, Roth is a great writer. But across his 30 books, I can't imagine they're all of a standard. But sort of this one, relatively sort of plucked at random because I wanted to read a Roth book in the light of his death, shows me that he is much far greater a writer than I'd ever imagined giving him credit for. Superb, superb. Okay, so thanks till next time.